Denmark, 1919. A young woman named Karoline is evicted from her apartment. Her husband left to fight in the Great War, and she hasn't heard from him in over a year. As a seamstress, she barely makes enough to pay for food. So when her charming boss begins to show interest in her, she begins a relationship that will hopefully save her from poverty. Her future is looking bright until she becomes pregnant with his child. Not only does he begin shunning her, but her husband Peter returns from the war, horribly disfigured. Pregnant with another man's child and married to a man she can barely look at, Karoline takes a knitting needle and goes to a public bathhouse to do the only thing she can think of. But what she doesn't know is that her life is about to get much, much worse. That's the first act of Girl with the Needle. It's a tightly packed series of events that thread you along its long and winding tapestry of real-world horrors. It's a piece of historical fiction, something that might go completely over your head as you become enraptured by its twisting narrative. Those watching in Denmark would be well aware of the notorious figure at the heart of the story, and therefore the director and writers chose a more roundabout way to approach the subject. Present it from a fictional third party. The entire first act of Needle focuses on Karoline, and it isn't until you're engrossed in her struggles that the movie inserts its historical figure without you realizing it. Magnus Van Horn's Girl with the Needle threads fiction and nonfiction together to present a story so horrifying that you'd otherwise doubt its authenticity. Historical fiction typically hinges on the authenticity of the world, drawing you in with the promise of real events only to use fiction to explain the inexplicable. The moments in history that seem implausible become more manageable if we can attach an element of fantasy or fiction in order to explain them away. From Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the Iliad, and Ivanhoe, to modern works like The Devil in the White City and Nickel Boys, historical fiction has been reshaping itself to fit any genre, from romance to horror. We have a natural fascination with events that actually happened, and having your favorite historical figure show up in a story is akin to seeing an obscure comic book character show up in whatever Marvel movie of the month is currently playing. It's the thrill of seeing something you recognize. Individuals who were just names in a textbook become fully fleshed out humans that you can relate and empathize with. But they can't do everything. They must stick to the guidelines we have become accustomed to. They must feel like authentic versions of their historical counterparts, or risk the entire facade fall flat. So why then does Needle spend an entire first third of its runtime on a fictional character who's seemingly unrelated to the historical events? The answer's rather simple: world building and immersion. The events that happen to and around Karoline seem excessively cruel, and the black and white world only reinforces this cruelty as the film goes on. It takes place in a post-war Copenhagen full of humans who have become numb to the suffering of those around them. It's a world where the rich use the poor and then throw them away when they are no longer needed. God forbid you're a poor woman. The narrow aspect ratio and lack of color help draw us into Karoline's world, a world that is suffocating and devoid of joy. So when Van Horn finally drops the historical horrors on us, we are already prepared. The narrative reinforces the reality. When the horrific historical events occur, the audience might gasp in horror, but they ultimately accept it. Karoline isn't a particularly likable character, and often makes selfish decisions, so when she reaches rock bottom, we understand why and how. She becomes yet another victim of her circumstances and allows us to empathize with women, mothers who are just struggling to get by. Much like the movie, I've been dancing around the historical figure the film is based on, and if you're remotely interested in watching, please stop and go check out the movie. It's available digitally on Mubi and is definitely worth a watch. Between 1915 and 1920 in Copenhagen, a woman named Dagmar Overby ran an unlicensed fostering and adoption service. Young, impoverished, and unmarried mothers would come to her with their newborn children, hearing the promise of a better life for their child. In 1920, a woman named Karoline placed an ad in a local newspaper, trying to find a new home for her child. Overby saw the ad and reached out to her, eventually taking in the baby. The day after the exchange, Agason regretted her decision and went back for her baby, only for Overby to tell her that it had already been adopted and she had conveniently lost the adoption papers. Agason went to the police. An investigation found the remains of a child in Overby's stove. Overby had been strangling, smothering, drowning, and even burning the babies alive. She was quickly arrested and sentenced to death on March 3, 1921, on 8 counts of murder, even though she confessed to 16 and was suspected of at least 24. The most tragic part is that every single child had been willingly given to Overby by mothers who seemingly had no other options. This is the focus of Girl with the Needle. It's a movie that uses the canvas of historical fiction to rework Karoline into an individual who not only encountered Overby, but becomes intimately connected with her.
When I first heard about Dagmar Overby, I didn't know about it. Only people in Denmark, only the Danes know about Dagmar Overby, no one else knows. This is a film about women being oppressed and what happens when you don't have a choice and where you start looking for help and choices. It's not an accident that this woman lived and did what she did. It's like there was a need for someone like her.
Magnus Van Horn and Line Langback adapted the story for the screen, and in doing so conducted extensive research, including retrieving the 122-page transcript of the Overby court case from the National Danish Archives and reviewing images of the stove where police found the remains of the victims. However, there was a major issue when making a movie about Dagmar Overby. How do you make your audience connect with a narrative about an infant murderer?
Nogle gange så er det så ensomt. Der er så mange liv, der passerer gennem den her lejlighed. Det sætter spor.
The two opted to focus on a new character, a fictionalized version of the woman who turned her in, Karoline. Van Horn addressed this decision in an interview with Collider. There is something psychopathic that we can't deny about Dagmar, he says. Making a story where she's the main character, you would always be at a distance. Girl with the Needle thereby became a balancing act of fact and fiction that would lead audiences along a path of one of the many mothers who sought out Dagmar Overby in the hopes of finding a new life for their child.
Ved de allerede, hvem der får mit barn? Nogle rigtig gode folk. Hun får det godt, du gør det rigtigt.
The character of Karoline returns to Dagmar after the exchange, much like her real-life counterpart, but instead of turning her over to the police, Karoline moves in with Dagmar, offering her services as a wet nurse.
Jeg har mælk i brysterne, så jeg kan amme børnene, mens de venter på deres nye familie. Jeg har heller ikke noget sted at tage.
And thus the main plot of Girl with the Needle unfolds. It's a push and pull between the two women as Dagmar slowly begins to mold Karoline into her assistant, and maybe even successor. She gets Karoline addicted to ether and shows her a few moments of happiness in an otherwise hopeless existence.
Det giver ingen mening med ham der. Hvorfor ikke? Der er ingen, der vil have ham.
This, combined with her maternal connection to the ill-fated babies, allows Karoline to find her purpose, but it is one that is directly in conflict with Dagmar's end goals. Van Horn and Langback create a narrative that shows how a figure like Dagmar could come into existence. Like I said earlier, Historical fiction is a genre that was created to fill in the gaps of history through fiction. And the gap here is how and why anyone would ever want to do what Dagmar Overby did. It becomes a story of women born into a world where they seemingly have no agency over their own bodies. Women who got pregnant on accident or worse from assault due to lack of education and healthcare services, and one woman who sees a twisted solution.
Der findes en anden måde. Jeg kan hjælpe dem med at finde en plejefamilie. Kom og besøg mig, når de er født.
Hvorfor skulle du hjælpe?
Hvem skulle ellers gøre det?
Dagmar tells Karoline that they are helping these women, providing them with comfort in the belief that their babies will go on to have happier lives.
Men vil du ikke selv have det?
Nej. Selvfølgelig vil jeg ikke det.
It's a tale from times past that still resonates today, as women's rights and bodily autonomy hang on the edge of an already unstable knife.
Klip dem af, så doktoren kan undersøge dem.
A large burden of this production is placed on Trine Dryholm, who portrays Dagmar in the film. Her performance is nuanced and often relies heavily on unspoken long takes only lit by candlelight. She alternates between a caring motherly figure who aids Karoline in the bathhouse to a savage, damaged individual who yearns for some connection, for someone to understand her motivations and why she believes this as a kindness.
Verden er et frygteligt sted. Men vi bliver nødt til at tro på, det ikke er sådan.
Karoline becomes this someone, and as the story progresses, Dryholm's performance becomes more aggressive as she tries to force her way of life on the other woman, an act of desperation that she believes will justify her actions, an act that would only further propagate the violence. But Dryholm can never reveal her full hand. She can never let the audience get too close to the elusive Dagmar. Her visage flickers under candlelight, and we can see her transform from mother to monster and sometimes catch a glimpse between. It is this area in between that is the most fascinating.
Nogle gange fortryder jeg også.
And it is the area where Dryholm truly resides with the character.
Jeg ved godt, det gør ondt.
Dagmar binds her trauma and tries to force it on Karoline to pass it on like mother to daughter. As we question how far Karoline will go, we are also questioning how far we would go in the same circumstance. Could we ever reach depths as low as Dagmar and Karoline? It's a horror that is far too real, and through his narrative, Van Horn is able to put his audience in the uncomfortable shoes of a woman in 1919 Copenhagen. The film opens with an uneasy melding of characters superimposed over one another, mashing and melding into one another. This imagery is repeated throughout the movie, through dreams and ether trips. Karoline begins to blur herself with Dagmar as much as we are blurring ourselves with Karoline, the audience surrogate. It's a haunting overture that emphasizes both the horrors and the message it's about to drill into its viewer.
Det er nemt. Du skal bare glemme til.
There is an unrelenting bleakness to the girl with the needle that only breaks during a single moment in the film. The scene where Karoline and Dagmar go to a movie and get extremely high. The two jovially laugh at the film as the audience around them grow frustrated. It was a surreal scene to experience at an actual theater, surrounded by strangers who had up to that point been watching a miserably depressing movie alongside me. This scene emphasizes the power of cinema and how it can transport two women at the darkest points of their lives to a place where they can feel joy for the first time in ages, albeit with the help of a little ether. In contrast, the movie we are actually watching has transported us to a moment in history so horrifying that we struggle to understand its authenticity. Why did this even happen? It's almost too dark, too horrific, and yet it actually occurred. Nicole Kidman once said, "We come to this place for magic, but I don't think this is what she intended." Heartbreak does not feel good in a place like this, but it isn't supposed to feel good. We are meant to be uncomfortable. The film is a hard watch, but its message is desperately necessary now more than ever. Girl with the Needle somehow manages to make this bleak narrative compelling despite aggressively repelling its audience, asking them to engage with characters in a world we would never wish to inhabit. But it is this lesson that we need to carry with us outside of the theater. We need to do everything we can so that women never have to resort to such drastic measures in order to maintain some semblance of control over their own lives. Van Horn and Langbeck's script ends on a surprisingly optimistic note in contrast to the rest of the movie, a notion that the future will be better for women as long as we continue to care for one another and fight for the rights of those we love, because there never should have been a Dagmar Overby, and hopefully there will never be one again.